So, okay, the one thing that I think, well, there's a few things, but I think something that stands out when we're looking at objective personality and maybe some of its weaknesses is they definitely are not wrong when we talk about the idea that there could potentially be, say, for example, 512 types. Because in
Mhm.
Jung's psychological types, he only has 8. And then he says, there's the potential for many more, which is why Briggs then did the 16. And the 16 were very natural evolutions of what kind of Jung was talking about. The issue I have with how objective personality has their 512 types, it's almost like they've expanded it really big and then solidified it in stone to a point where you're so specific in your personality type that there's no chance for variation or change throughout the life. And this
Okay.
is something that I disagree with when we're talking about an overall type. So I personally, when I look at, say, for example, an ENFP, I see that as a type with many sub variations of how they can portray themselves depending on their point in life or where they are, depending on their mental health, how they've gone through life, these types of things.
Okay.
For example, this is why OP has jumpers or double introverted or double extroverted types. I would call this a developmental stage in a traditional Jungian view. Because Jung himself would say, I don't think it's necessarily a great idea for a type to be that introverted or that extroverted because they need that auxiliary function to act as a balancing point for their overall psyche.
Mhm.
So that's kind of one of my big issues with the 512 type system is that it's so specific that you don't allow for variation. Now, imagine if you had like ENFP and then the subtypes of ENFP, and maybe you could find yourself at different points within their system, then I wouldn't have as much as a gripe with it. But the way they have it set up now is they're teaching you that you are this and there's no variation in that, and you shouldn't attempt to maybe like work on some of those other functions or become like a paragon version of yourself. I don't know the best way to say that, but
yeah. Do you mind if I ask any questions?
Yeah,
about
that's fine.
Okay, so I guess so with that pushback specifically, would you prefer the system to basically say you can change types over time? Is that what I'm hearing?
So it's difficult because when we talk about changing types, that's why I don't like to think of them as other types, but more so a variation of a singular type.
Okay.
Because in the Jungian model, you don't switch types. If you're an ENFP, you're going to be an ENFP.
Right.
But the way I look at it, you could be an ENFP at a point where your first and third function are really kind of overactive at this point in your life. And you might even see that you're going to be facing a lot of issues because of that. And if you balance out with your auxiliary, then you might find you're more healthy. Or you might be at a point where you're just now learning about the issues of your repressed function and it's really dragging you down. And that could totally change how you're presenting yourself. And maybe you find that you're stuck in your second and fourth function and you're someone who you're not usually like. And I think that's why it's better to have it as kind of like the umbrella singular type with these smaller ones under them.
Okay. I'm going to ask one follow-up question. Okay. And I'm going to have to set up a little bit to ask this, right?
That's fine.
So my understanding is that the reason Dave and Shan they expanded. I think they originally wanted 32 actually. Or actually, no, I think they originally wanted 16 actually. So when they first started attempting this inter-rater reliability test where they're trying to get the same type, they wanted the standard Myers-Briggs 16. But what they were saying was over time, it actually made it much more likely that they would get the same type if they were more specific. So from a tracking standpoint, that's why they started expanding.
And that makes complete sense because the more you narrow down something, the more easily you're going to be able to kind of repeatedly find results associated with that. The issue is that in terms of general psychological, self and how our minds work, we do have some variation, especially in how we're going to be developing these functions.
Okay. So I guess the question I have then is purely from a tracking standpoint, not from a self-growth standpoint. So ignoring their message about self-growth, purely as a tracking system of which, precisely how you developed your type as of this moment.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the system?
I think it could work in that sense. You could say this is where you are right now, and maybe if you developed a plan for that, but then you have to get into the idea of what do you think an optimal type looks like. And that's a difficult question because it's not like Every ENFP, for example, is going to have the best way to present themselves and their functions. All we can say when we look at it from a Jungian standpoint is that there's general guidelines to follow for mental health. Specifically, be aware of your repressed function. Don't try to become it. He always says if you try to become your repressed function or master it, you will fail every time. And your auxiliary function is the thing that you should be working on if you want to balance yourself, if you want to become a better, more healthy version of you. We're so obsessed with our dominant and blind to our fourth that the auxiliary acts as that healthy median between our dominant attitude. So as an introvert, that would be extroversion, or as an extrovert, it would be introversion. Because the repressed function, if we try to engage in that, it's just like, oh, it's chaotic. And then the auxiliary function is, oh, it's a little bit in the middle. There's some health to it. It also helps me communicate my needs and my ways of perceiving things.
Okay, really good.